Returning home earlier than expected, a businessman catches his wife being cruel to his mother, who suffers from Alzheimer's. That moment unveils hidden truths. The wife only wanted status, while the housekeeper had always been the true caregiver. After reading a revealing letter and reuniting with his forgotten brother, he decides to rebuild his family based on real love. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The afternoon was setting over London, with that dense December gloom that seemed to cling to the skin. Richard Anderson drove his black saloon through the streets of the Hampstead neighborhood, where his mansion stood imposing behind high walls and well-tended gardens. At 48, Richard was a man of serious appearance, with greying hair at the temples and a posture that conveyed the weight of someone who had built an empire from scratch. His textile company, Anderson Textiles, was one of the most respected in the sector across the country, supplying major retail chains and even international brands. On that Friday afternoon, however, Richard didn't feel the usual pride when thinking about his business. The meeting with Japanese investors had been cancelled at the last minute, something about a problem with their flight. This meant he would be home earlier than usual, which was rare. For the past 2 years, since he had remarried, Richard had been working even harder, as if unconsciously avoiding spending too much time at home. As he approached the electronic gate, Richard pressed the remote control and waited for it to open slowly. It was then that he heard raised voices coming from the side garden. Frowning, he turned off the engine and got out of the car cautiously, walking towards the ivy-covered wall that separated the main entrance from the back garden. The voices grew clearer with each step. One of them he recognized immediately. It was Veronica, his wife. At 32, she was a woman of striking beauty, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a way of speaking that mixed sweetness and firmness, as convenience dictated. They had met at a charity event organized by a mutual friend. Veronica was an advertising executive, or so she presented herself, although Richard had never seen her actually work since their marriage. She came from a family of declining middle-class status and didn't hide how much she appreciated the comfort that life with Richard provided. The other voice belonged to Mrs. Edna, the housekeeper. At 55, Edna had been working for the family for almost 20 years. She had been hired back when Helen, Richard's first wife, was still alive. She was a woman of medium height with brown hair always tied in a simple bun and brown eyes that conveyed a genuine kindness. Edna was more than an employee. She knew every corner of that house, every story, every secret kept in the old drawers. Richard moved closer, hiding behind the plant-covered wall. He wasn't one to spy on anyone, but something in the tone of the voices made him stop and pay attention. Veronica was speaking loudly, irritated. Her sweet tone had vanished completely, replaced by a harshness Richard rarely heard. She was saying something about his mother, Mrs. Antonia. Mrs. Antonia was a 76-year-old woman living with advanced stage Alzheimer's. Since Richard's father had passed away 3 years ago, she had been living in the mansion. The disease had progressed rapidly, and now Mrs. Antonia spent most of her time confused, not recognizing where she was or who the people around her were. There were days when she would look at Richard and call him by his late father's name. Other days, she simply wouldn't speak, lost in an internal world that no one could reach. Veronica's voice echoed again. "Just leave her here by the window, Edna. She won't even notice. She's cooped up in that stuffy room. It's all day. She needs some fresh air." Edna's reply came firmly but respectfully. "Mrs. Veronica, you know Mrs. Antonia can't be left in a cold draft like this. She's fragile. She could get sick. The doctor was very clear about that." "I didn't ask for your opinion, Edna. I decide what's best for her. You're just a maid. With all due respect, ma'am, I've been taking care of Mrs. Antonia for years. I know her needs better than anyone in this house." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He had never witnessed Veronica speaking that way, let alone to Edna. He felt the urge to intervene immediately, but something made him stay where he was. He needed to understand what was happening. Veronica let out a sarcastic laugh. "You think you're special for taking care of an old woman who doesn't even know who you are. She doesn't recognize anyone, Edna. She's a burden to all of us. She should be in a nursing home, not here, getting in the way." Richard clenched his fists. How dare Veronica speak about his mother like that? Edna remained silent for a moment, and then her voice sounded even more determined. "Mrs. Antonia is not a burden. She is a person who deserves to be treated with dignity and care, and as long as I am here, I will ensure she receives it. You're in charge of nothing in this house, Edna. If I want to, I can fire you today. You can try, but Mr. Richard knows very well who truly cares for his mother." "Oh, really? And you think he cares? He barely looks at her. He spends the entire day working, comes home late, doesn't even ask how she is. If it were up to him, the old woman would have been abandoned long ago." Richard felt the words like a stab. Could it be true? Had he really become so distant? He worked a lot, yes, but he always thought Mrs. Antonia was being well cared for. Veronica always said everything was under control, that Edna was taking care of everything. He trusted that. Or did he just want to believe it to avoid facing the pain of watching his mother fade away? Then he heard shuffling footsteps. Peeking through the ivy leaves, Richard saw his mother. Mrs. Antonia was in a white nightgown, her white hair disheveled, her gaze lost. She was walking slowly, as if unsure where she was going. Veronica was holding her by the arm, pushing her gently but firmly towards an open area of the garden exposed to the cold wind. Come on, Mrs. Antonia. A bit of fresh air will do you good." Edna quickly approached, placing herself between Veronica and the elderly woman. "Please, Mrs. Veronica, let me take care of her. I'll take her inside where it's warm, get her some hot tea, a warm compress. She's shivering, look." "Get out of my way, Edna." "I will not." The two women stared each other down. Richard saw the exact moment Veronica realized she wouldn't win this battle. She let go of Mrs. Antonia's arm abruptly and took a step back, crossing her arms. "Do whatever you want then, but this will have consequences. I'm going to talk to Richard." "Go ahead. I'm sure he'll want to hear my side of the story as well." Veronica turned and walked back into the house, slamming the patio door shut. Edna sighed in relief and turned to Mrs. Antonia with a gentle smile. "Come on, Mrs. Antonia, let's go inside where it's warm, shall we? I'll make you that nice cup of tea you like." Mrs. Antonia looked at Edna with a vague expression, but then smiled slightly, a fragile, almost childlike smile. Edna took her hand gently and led her to a comfortable armchair near the fireplace inside. Richard remained still for a few minutes, processing everything he had witnessed. He felt a mixture of anger, guilt, and sadness. How had things reached this point without him noticing? He had married Veronica believing she would be a companion, someone who would bring new life to a house that still carried the pain of Helen's loss. But what he had just witnessed revealed a side of Veronica he had never seen. He entered through the main door, closing it silently behind him. The house was quiet, with the heavy silence of a cold afternoon. He went up the stairs towards the bedroom he shared with Veronica. She was there, sitting at her dressing table, touching up her makeup as if nothing had happened. "You're home early," she said without looking at him, her tone once again sweet and controlled. "The meeting was cancelled. What a shame. Well, since you're here, could you take me out for dinner? We haven't been out in ages." Richard watched her in the mirror. Veronica was beautiful, no doubt, but at that moment, all he could see was the cruel woman who had just humiliated Edna and disrespected his mother. "Not tonight, Veronica. I'm tired." She frowned slightly, but then smiled again. "All right. I'll call Frances then. Maybe she'll want to go out." Richard didn't reply. He went back downstairs and straight to his study, closing the door behind him. He sat in the leather armchair behind the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. This was his sanctuary, the place where he made important decisions, and now he had to decide what to do with what he had discovered. Hours passed. Richard sat there, thinking, remembering. When was the last time he had truly spoken to his mother? When was the last time he had sat beside her, held her hand, looked into her eyes? He remembered when Mrs. Antonia was a strong, determined woman who had helped his father build the family business. She used to hand-sew the first pieces they sold at markets. She was the one who managed the finances, who negotiated with suppliers, Richard had inherited her determination and sense of justice. And now? Now she was a shadow of her former self, lost in her own mind, dependent on the kindness of others. And he, her son, had been absent. He had let a stranger decide how his mother would be treated. It was already night when Richard finally left the study. The house was silent. Veronica had gone out, probably to meet her friends. He went up to Mrs. Antonia's room, located on the second floor away from the master bedroom. The door was ajar and a soft light came from within. He entered slowly. Mrs. Antonia was lying in bed, her eyes closed. Edna was sitting in a chair beside her, knitting what looked like a scarf. She looked up when she saw Richard and immediately stood up. "Good evening, Mr. Richard. She's had her dinner and taken her medication. She's sleeping peacefully." Richard approached the bed and looked at his mother's face. Even in sleep, there was a worried expression, as if her dreams brought her no peace. "Edna, we need to talk, but not here. Could you come with me to the study?" Edna nodded, setting her knitting aside. She adjusted the blanket over Mrs. Antonia and followed Richard downstairs. In the study, he closed the door and gestured for her to sit in one of the armchairs. Edna hesitated, but eventually accepted. "I know this is unusual, but I need you to be honest with me. What is happening in this house?" Edna looked down, clasping her hands in her lap. "Mr. Richard, I didn't want to cause any trouble, but the situation is getting difficult. I was home earlier today. I heard the argument between you and Veronica." Edna looked up quickly, surprised. "Oh, you heard?" "I heard everything. I want you to tell me exactly what's going on. When did this start?" Edna sighed deeply, as if she had been carrying a burden for a long time. "It started a few months after your wedding. At first, Mrs. Veronica was polite to Mrs. Antonia, not affectionate but polite. Over time, she started to show impatience. She complained about the noise Mrs. Antonia made at night when she was confused. She complained about having to change the house's routine because of her. Gradually, she became more hostile. Hostile how? Edna looked at her, hands clearly uncomfortable. She ignores her completely. When Mrs. Antonia tries to talk to her, Mrs. Veronica acts as if no one is there. I've heard her say cruel things, that she was a nuisance, that she should be in a home somewhere. She forbade Mrs. Antonia from leaving her room during her friends' visits, saying it was embarrassing. Richard felt anger growing inside him. "And me? Why did you never tell me any of this? You were always so busy, Mr. Richard. And I was afraid that Mrs. Veronica would follow through on her threat to fire me. If I left, who would take care of Mrs. Antonia? At least by being here I can protect her." Edna's words fell like lead on Richard's heart. She was right. He had been so absent that he hadn't even noticed what was happening under his own roof. "You're not going to be fired, Edna, I guarantee it. And I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for my mother. I know you're the one who has truly taken care of her all these years." Edna smiled, her eyes welling up. "Mrs. Helen asked me to, Mr. Richard, before she passed. She made me promise I would look after Mrs. Antonia as if she were my own mother." The mention of Helen brought a wave of emotions. Helen had passed away 5 years ago, a victim of a serious illness that consumed her in a few months. She and Richard had been married for 15 years, and they were happy. Helen was kind, generous, and loved that house and everyone in it. Her death had left an immense void. "She left something with you, didn't she? I remember seeing her give you a box," Edna nodded slowly. "Yes, it's kept in my room. Mrs. Helen said it was to be opened when you were ready." "Ready for what?" "She didn't say. She just asked me to keep it safe." Richard was silent for a moment. Was he ready now? Ready to face whatever Helen had left for him? "I'd like to see that box, Edna." She stood up immediately. "I'll get it." A few minutes later, Edna returned carrying a dark wooden box, not very large, but clearly old. She placed it on the desk carefully. Richard looked at it for a long moment before opening it. The wood was polished, with small carvings on the sides. He recognized the craftsmanship. It had been made by Helen's father, a talented carpenter. With trembling hands, Richard opened the box. Inside were old photographs, documents yellowed with age, some letters, and on top of everything a white envelope with his name written in Helen's delicate handwriting. He picked up the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter of several pages. Richard began to read, and with each line he felt the world around him transform. Helen had written the letter shortly before she died. In it she wrote about a discovery she had made years earlier, during a pregnancy that unfortunately did not come to term. She had investigated the family's genetic history to understand possible complications, and it was then that she discovered something the Anderson family had hidden for decades. Richard had a younger brother, a brother he believed had been sent to live with distant relatives when he was just a child. But the truth was very different and much more painful. The brother, named Paul, had been born with a mild cognitive disability. At the time, Richard's parents, concerned about the family's reputation and business, made the decision to place him in an orphanage. They told Richard, who was only 6 at the time, that his baby brother had gone to live with relatives in the countryside. Helen had traced Paul's whereabouts. He had never been adopted, growing up in the orphanage and later in foster homes. Now, at 43, he lived modestly in a simple neighborhood in East London and worked as a caretaker at a state primary school. Helen described Paul as a kind person who, despite the difficulties, had found purpose in helping children with learning difficulties at the school where he worked. The letter ended with a request from Helen. She asked that Richard, when he was ready, find his brother, that he give him the chance to have a family again, that he correct the mistake their parents had made decades ago. Richard finished reading with tears streaming down his face. Edna stood there, silent, respecting the moment. He looked at her and saw that she was crying too. "You knew about this?" "Mrs. Helen told me shortly before she passed. She said she would explain everything in the letter. She wanted you to find out, when the time was right." "And why didn't you tell me sooner?" "It wasn't my story to tell, Mr. Richard. It was Mrs. Helen's, and she trusted that you would know when the time was right." Richard looked at the letter again. There was an address written at the end, the address where Paul lived. He took the documents from the box and examined them. There were birth certificates, orphanage records, old medical reports, everything proving the existence of his younger brother, the brother he thought he had lost but who had actually been torn from his life. He thought of his mother, sleeping upstairs. Did Mrs. Antonia remember Paul? Did the ghost of that lost son sometimes appear in her confused mind? Richard knew what he had to do. But first, he needed to organize his priorities. First, he needed to ensure his mother was protected. Second, he needed to deal with Veronica and what his marriage had become. And third, he needed to find his brother. "Edna, from now on, I want you to document everything. Anything Veronica does or says regarding my mother. Note the dates, times, what was said. We're going to need it." "You going to—" "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to protect my mother, and I'm going to find my brother." Edna smiled, relieved. "Mrs. Helen would be so proud, Mr. Richard." He nodded, putting the letter back in the box. That night, Richard barely slept. Lying next to Veronica, who snored lightly, he stared at the ceiling, planning his next steps. He felt he was on the verge of a profound change in his life, a change that would bring painful but necessary truths to light. When the sun rose over London, bringing another cold winter day, Richard was already up. He dressed in silence and went down to the study. He took the box Edna had brought and placed it in his car. Before leaving, he passed by his mother's room. Mrs. Antonia was already awake, sitting in bed looking out the window. Edna was helping her get dressed. "Good morning, Mum," Richard said, approaching. Mrs. Antonia turned to him. Her gaze was distant, but there was something there, a flicker of recognition. "My son," she murmured. Richard felt his heart ache. She had recognized him. At least in that moment. She knew who he was. He knelt beside the bed and held her hand. "I'm here, Mum, and I'm going to take care of everything. I promise." Mrs. Antonia smiled, stroking her son's face with a trembling hand. "You're a good boy. Always were." He kissed her hand and stood up, nodding to Edna in thanks. Then he left the house with determination. He had a brother to find, and nothing was going to stop him. The truth, however painful, needed to come out, and Richard was ready to face it, whatever the cost. The drive from west to East London took over an hour. Richard drove through the city's dense traffic, crossing neighbourhoods that seemed like completely different worlds from the Hampstead where he lived. The streets gradually changed, mansions giving way to commercial buildings, then to simpler houses until he finally reached the Stratford neighbourhood, where, according to the address left by Helen, his brother Paul lived. Richard parked in front of a small three-storey building with faded paint and a modest entrance. The address was flat 205, second floor. He took a deep breath before getting out of the car. His hands were sweating. His heart was racing. How should he introduce himself? What would he say? Did Paul even know he had a brother looking for him? Or had someone told him the truth at some point in his life? He climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of home-cooked food coming from some of the flats. Children were playing in the hallway, laughing loudly. It was a stark contrast to the controlled silence of his own home. Here there was life, noise, movement. He reached the door of flat 205 and stood there for a few seconds, gathering his courage. Finally, he rang the bell. Footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened, and Richard found himself face to face with a man of medium height, with brown hair starting to go grey and dark, kind eyes. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. There was something familiar about his face, something Richard recognized immediately. The eyes, they were his mother's eyes. "Good afternoon, can I help you?" the man asked with a polite smile. Richard swallowed hard. "Are you Paul? Paul Anderson?" The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression of curiosity mixed with caution. "I am. Who are you?" "My name is Richard Anderson. I'm your brother." The silence that followed was heavy. Paul stared at him, processing the words. His face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, disbelief. Then he took a step back, as if he needed distance to better understand the situation. "I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken. I don't have a family. I grew up in an orphanage." "I know, and that's exactly why I'm here. We need to talk, please." Paul hesitated, but something in Richard's sincere gaze must have convinced him. He opened the door completely and gestured for Richard to enter. The flat was small but extremely neat and clean. The living room had a simple sofa, a bookshelf with books, and a few modest ornaments. There were photos on the wall, mostly of children. Paul noticed Richard looking. "They're my pupils. I work as a caretaker at Professor Anthony Rodriguez State School nearby, but I also help the children who are struggling with their lessons. Many of them come from difficult families. They need extra support." Richard nodded, touched by the generosity of this man he barely knew. They sat down facing each other. Richard didn't know where to begin. Paul spoke first. "You said you're my brother, but I never knew I had a family. I was always told I was abandoned as a baby." "You weren't abandoned. You were taken from us." Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "Our parents, they made a terrible decision. When you were born, you had some developmental delays. They were scared, ashamed perhaps, worried about the family's reputation. So they decided to put you in an orphanage and told me you had gone to live with distant relatives." Paul looked at him intently, absorbing every word. "How old were you?" 6. "I was 6 when you were born. I vaguely remember a baby in the house, but then he was gone. I grew up believing the lie they told me. Until last night when I found out the truth." "How did you find out?" Richard told him about Helen, about the box, about the letter she had left. He told him how she had tracked Paul down, how she had discovered the truth, and decided Richard deserved to know. As he spoke, he watched Paul's reactions. There was pain there, but also a resignation, as if this revelation confirmed something he had always suspected. When Richard finished, Paul was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed deeply. "I always felt there was something wrong with the story they told me. It didn't make sense to have been simply abandoned like that. But over time, I learned to accept it. I built my life, found my purpose. I help children who go through difficult situations because I understand what it's like to grow up without a family, without belonging anywhere. You do belong, Paul. You always have. And I came here to apologize for what our parents did and to say that if you want, I'd like to get to know you better. I'd like to have a brother again. Paul's eyes filled with tears. He quickly wiped them with the back of his hand, embarrassed. I'm sorry. It's a lot to take in at once. I understand. And I don't expect you to make any decisions right now. But there's one more thing. Richard took a deep breath. Our mother, she's still alive. She lives with me, but she's ill. She has Alzheimer's. Most days she doesn't recognize anyone. But who knows, maybe she'll remember you at some point. Paul looked up surprised. She's alive? Our mother. She is. And I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd like you to meet her, or rather, be reunited with her. Does she know about me? Does she know I was put in an orphanage? I don't know. The disease has erased many memories, but sometimes she has moments of lucidity. And I thought that maybe seeing you could awaken something in her. Paul got up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. Richard respected his silence, waiting. Finally, Paul turned around. I need some time to process all this. It's a lot of information. My whole life I believed one thing, and now I find out it was a lie. Of course, I completely understand. Take all the time you need. Richard took a business card from his pocket and held it out. This is my number. Call me when you're ready, or if you want to talk more. Anytime. Paul took the card and looked at it. Then he looked at Richard with a new intensity. Can I ask you a question? You can. Why now? Why after all these years? Richard felt the weight of the question. Because I discovered I was living a lie, not just about you, but about my own life. I remarried 2 years ago thinking I was rebuilding a family, but I found out yesterday that my wife treats our mother with contempt, that she sees her illness as a burden, and it made me realize that I was being complicit, being absent, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Helen's letter woke me up. It made me see that I need to right the wrongs of the past, starting with finding you. Paul nodded. Slowly. Your wife, is she Helen's mother? No. Helen passed away 5 years ago. I remarried afterwards. A decision I now question. I'm sorry for your loss. She sounds like she was a special woman to have done all that. She was. She was very special. The two were silent for a few more minutes. Then Paul walked Richard to the door. Before opening it, he touched Richard's arm. Thank you for coming. I know it couldn't have been easy. It was necessary, and I hope we can get to know each other better. You seem like a good man, Paul. I'm trying to be. Every day. Richard returned to his car with mixed feelings. There was a deep sadness for the lost time, for the childhood Paul had had to face alone. But there was also hope. Paul was a kind man who, despite everything, had found a way to contribute to the world. That said a lot about his character. On the way back, Richard stopped at a traffic light and picked up his phone. There were several messages from Veronica asking where he was. He ignored them. He wasn't ready to deal with her yet. First, he needed to think, to organize his priorities. When he got home, it was late afternoon. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. He parked in the garage and entered through the kitchen door. Edna was there, preparing dinner. How did it go, Mr. Richard? I found my brother. We talked. He needs time to process everything, but I think it was a good start. Edna smiled. I'm so happy to hear that. How is my mother? She had a quiet day, ate her lunch well, rested in the afternoon. She's in her room now, listening to music. She likes those old songs, you know. It seems to calm her. Richard went up to Mrs. Antonia's room. The door was ajar, and from inside came the soft sound of an old ballad. He entered slowly. His mother was sitting in an armchair near the window, looking out at the garden. She seemed serene, lost in her own thoughts. Hi, Mum, Richard said, approaching. Mrs. Antonia turned to him, but her gaze was vacant. She didn't seem to recognize him at that moment. Richard felt a pang of sadness, but sat in another chair near her. I wanted to tell you something. Today I met someone very special, someone you knew a long time ago. Mrs. Antonia looked at him but didn't respond. Richard continued anyway. "His name is Paul, your son, my brother. I know you might not remember him now, but one day, maybe you will. And when that happens, I'll bring him here to see you." For an instant, something changed in Mrs. Antonia's gaze. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Richard swore he saw a flicker of recognition, or perhaps pain. She murmured something so low he could barely hear it. "Paul?" Richard's heart raced. "Yes, Mum, Paul, do you remember him?" But the moment passed. Mrs. Antonia went back to looking out the window, lost again in her internal world. Richard sat there for a few more minutes, holding her hand, before getting up and leaving. In the hallway, he found Veronica. She was elegantly dressed, ready to go out. "Where have you been all day? I tried calling you 1,000 times." "I was dealing with personal matters." "What matters? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because they're none of your business, Veronica." Her eyes widened, surprised by his tone. "What do you mean, none of my business? I'm your wife." Richard faced her. "Lately, I've been wondering what that really means to you. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about loyalty, about respect, about compassion. I'm talking about how you treat my mother." Veronica's face turned red. "Oh, I see. Edna came tattling, did she? That viper must have twisted everything." "It wasn't Edna who told me. I saw it with my own eyes. I heard it with my own ears. I saw you trying to leave my mother in the cold. I saw you humiliate Edna. I heard you say, 'My mother is a burden.'" Veronica turned pale. "Richard, I can explain." "You don't need to explain. Everything is very clear. And I want you to know that from now on, things are going to change in this house." "What kind of changes?" "Necessary ones. And you'll have to decide if you can adapt to them or not." He walked past her and went downstairs, leaving Veronica standing in the hallway, dumbfounded. Richard entered the study and closed the door. He needed to think clearly about his next steps. He knew he couldn't stay married to Veronica. What he had seen, what he had heard, was unforgivable. But he needed to do it the right way, especially to protect his mother. In the following days, a palpable tension filled the house. Veronica walked around the mansion with an expression somewhere between anger and fear. She tried a few times to get close to Richard, to be affectionate, like in the early months of their marriage, but he kept his distance, polite but cold. Richard also began to spend more time with his mother. Every morning, before going to the company, he would go up to her room and have breakfast with her, even if Mrs. Antonia didn't know who he was. In the evening, when he returned, he would sit by her side, tell her about his day, show her old photos. Edna watched it all with a smile on her face, happy to see the son present again in his mother's life. A week after his first meeting with Paul, Richard received a call. It was him. "Hi, Richard. It's Paul." "Paul, how are you?" "I'm well. Listen, I've thought a lot about what we talked about, and I'd like to meet our mother, if the invitation still stands." Richard felt immense joy. "Of course it does. When can you come?" "How about tomorrow? It's my day off from work." "Perfect. I'll send you my address. You can come whenever you like." "Richard, there's one more thing. Don't expect too much from her. I mean, if she doesn't recognize me, that's okay. I just want to meet her, see her face, be near her." "I understand, and regardless of what happens, the important thing is that you'll be here." The next day, Richard woke up earlier than usual. He was anxious. He told Edna that Paul was coming, and she was moved. Together, they prepared everything. Edna made a lemon drizzle cake, Mrs. Antonia's old favorite, and brewed fresh coffee. Richard arranged some old photos, including one he had found from when Paul was a baby. Veronica noticed the activity. "Who's coming over today?" "A visitor," Richard replied dryly. "What kind of visitor?" "Family." She was about to ask more, but the intercom buzzed. Richard went to answer it himself. It was Paul. He pressed the button to open the gate and went to the front door to wait. When Paul appeared, walking up the entrance steps, Richard noticed he was nervous. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers. He had clearly dressed up for the occasion. "Welcome," Richard said, opening the door. Paul entered, looking around with wide eyes. "Wow, this is a huge house." Come, I'll introduce you to some people. First, Richard took him to the kitchen. Edna was there, and when she saw Paul, her eyes filled with tears. "My goodness, you look just like Mrs. Antonia when she was young," she exclaimed. Paul smiled, embarrassed. "You must be Edna. Richard told me about you." "And I'd heard about you, without even knowing it. Mrs. Helen told me everything before she passed. She wanted this day to come so much." The three of them went up together to Mrs. Antonia's room. Richard knocked lightly on the door before entering. His mother was sitting on the bed, looking at her hands. When she saw Richard, she smiled vaguely. "Hello, my son." Richard approached, holding her hand. "Mum, I've brought someone for you to meet." He gestured for Paul to come in. Paul took a few hesitant steps. When Mrs. Antonia saw him, her face changed completely. She became very still, staring at him, intently. Paul approached slowly and knelt by the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hello," he said in a soft voice. Mrs. Antonia reached out a trembling hand and touched Paul's face. Her eyes filled with tears. She began to cry silently, still stroking his face. "My boy, my little boy." Paul began to cry too. "I'm here. I'm okay. I'm so sorry. So sorry. You don't have to be. It's all okay now." Richard and Edna watched, both with tears in their eyes. It was a moment of profound reconnection, of healing old wounds. Mrs. Antonia hugged Paul, holding him tightly against her as she would a child. He let her, resting his head on her shoulder, finally allowing himself to feel the mother's love that had been denied to him his whole life. They stayed like that for several minutes until Mrs. Antonia calmed down. She pulled back a little and looked at Paul again, as if wanting to memorize every detail of his face. "You've grown. You've become strong." Paul smiled through his tears. "I had to learn how. Forgive this mother. Forgive me. I already have. And now I'm here." They talked for hours. Sometimes Mrs. Antonia would forget who Paul was and ask his name again. He would answer with infinite patience, not minding having to introduce himself multiple times. The important thing was being there, beside her. During lunch, they all sat together at the table. Veronica appeared curious. When she saw Paul, she frowned. "Who is this?" "This is my brother Paul," Richard answered naturally. "Your brother? You never mentioned having a brother." "There were a lot of things I didn't know about my own family, but I'm finding out now." Veronica looked from Richard to Paul, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, what a surprise." She sat at the table but barely touched her food, watching the interaction between the three with a sour expression. After lunch, Richard took Paul on a tour of the mansion. He showed him the garden where he used to play as a child, the study that had belonged to their father, the old photos hanging on the walls. Paul absorbed it all with a mixture of fascination and melancholy. When they reached the back garden, they sat on a bench under a large oak tree. "Thank you for bringing me here," said Paul, "even though it hurts a little to see everything that could have been. It's important. It's a part of me that was missing. You belong here, Paul. You always have. And I wanted to make you a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "I want you to come live here, with us. I know you have your life, your job, but we can arrange everything. And I think it would be good for our mother to have you around." Paul looked at the house, then at Richard. "I don't know if that would be a good idea. I don't want to cause any trouble. Your wife didn't seem very happy with my presence. Veronica won't be a problem for much longer." Paul understood the implicit meaning. Even so, he hesitated. "I need to think, Richard. It's a lot of change at once." "Of course. You don't have to decide now. But please think about it, okay?" "I will." When Paul left, it was already evening. He said goodbye to Mrs. Antonia with a long hug, promising to return soon. She held his face between her hands and said something that moved them all again. "Don't disappear, my son. Don't disappear again." "I won't. I promise." Richard walked him to the gate. Before getting into his car, Paul turned. "You know, today was one of the most important days of my life. Thank you for this." "You don't have to thank me. We're family, and family takes care of each other." Paul nodded and got into his car. Richard watched him drive away, feeling that he was finally on the right path. He returned to the house with a renewed sense of purpose. There was still much to do, many things to resolve. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he was living authentically, aligned with his true values. He found Veronica in the living room waiting for him. "We need to talk," she said. "Yes, we do." And so, with the emotional reunion still echoing in his heart, Richard prepared for the next step of his journey, a step that would involve confronting difficult truths and making decisions that would change his life forever. Veronica was standing in the living room, arms crossed, her face tense. Richard entered and closed the door behind him, preparing for the conversation he knew was inevitable. "So," Veronica began, her tone controlled but with an underlying tension, "are you going to explain what's going on? Where did this brother come from, and why didn't I know anything about him?" Richard walked to the window, looking out at the garden illuminated by the exterior lights. "You didn't know because I didn't know. I only found out a few days ago. My parents hid his existence my whole life. And now, suddenly, he shows up here, part of the family?" Veronica let out a sarcastic laugh. "Richard, you need to be careful. You know nothing about this man. He could be after your money." Richard turned, slowly, to face her. "You're not concerned about the situation at all, are you? About the fact that I discovered I have a brother who was abandoned by my parents? Your only concern is money." "I'm being practical. Someone here has to be. You're letting your emotions take over. First this whole thing with your mother, now this long-lost brother. It's like a soap opera." "Maybe because it's real, Veronica. Real people, real feelings, real pain. But you wouldn't understand that, would you?" Veronica's face flushed. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am your wife." "Are you? Because lately I've been wondering why you married me. Was it for the person I am or for the life I could offer?" Veronica was silent for a few seconds, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "This is ridiculous. Of course I married you because I love you. Do you? Or did you marry what I represent? The financial security, the social status, the comfortable life? Because love, Veronica, love involves respecting the people who are important to me. And you show no respect for my mother." "This again," Veronica exploded. "Your mother doesn't even know who I am most days. She doesn't recognize anyone. Why do I have to pretend to enjoy taking care of someone who doesn't even notice my presence? Because it's the right thing to do. Because she is a human being who deserves dignity and compassion. Because she is my mother. And I am your wife. But it seems that means nothing to you. Ever since you found that damned letter, you've changed completely." "I haven't changed, Veronica. I've just woken up to the kind of person you really are. And to the kind of person I was becoming by neglecting my responsibilities." Veronica took a step forward, her face now distorted with anger. "You know what? I'm tired of this. Tired of being judged by you, by Edna, by everyone in this house. I didn't get married to be a nurse for a senile old woman." The words echoed through the room like a gunshot. Richard felt his anger rise but forced himself to stay calm. This time his voice came out low, but firm. "Then I guess there's nothing more to be said. I want you to leave this house." Veronica's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "You heard me. I want a divorce. And I want you out of my house. You can stay at the flat in Canary Wharf, the one in my name. I'll transfer it to you as part of the settlement. But I don't want you here near my mother ever again. You can't just kick me out like this. I have rights. You do, and I will honor them. My lawyer will be in touch to sort out the details. But as of today, this marriage is over." Veronica stared at him, incredulous. For a few seconds, it seemed she would argue more. But then something shifted in her expression. The mask of the devoted wife finally fell away completely, revealing the coldness that had always been there, hidden. "You know what, Richard? Maybe it's for the best. I never could stand this charade, pretending to care about your dysfunctional family. Your father was a coward who abandoned his own son. Your mother is a shadow of her former self, and you're so blind you didn't even realize your marriage was a lie from the start." Richard didn't reply. He had expected this reaction, the revelation of the real Veronica. In a way, it was even a relief to see he wasn't mistaken about her. "I'll pack my things," Veronica said, turning to leave the room. "But don't think you'll get rid of me that easily. I'll make sure I get every penny I'm entitled to. Be my guest. Money is the only thing you truly value anyway." Veronica paused at the door, looking at him over her shoulder. "And you, Richard? What do you value? Your sick mother who doesn't even remember you. A strange brother you barely know. A life of sacrifice and obligation. Must be very fulfilling." She left, leaving Richard alone in the room. He heard her footsteps going up the stairs, then the sound of drawers being opened and slammed shut. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made, but at the same time he felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Edna appeared at the door shyly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richard. I couldn't help but overhear some of the conversation." "It's all right, Edna. It was inevitable. You did the right thing." "I hope so." In the following weeks, the mansion underwent a transformation. Veronica took her things and moved into the flat, not without making it clear that her lawyers would be in touch. Richard handled everything professionally, ensuring she received what she was entitled to, but remaining firm in his decision to end the marriage. With Veronica's departure, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. It was as if a heavy cloud had dissipated. Edna became more relaxed, smiling more often. Mrs. Antonia, though not fully understanding what was happening, seemed more peaceful, as if she could feel the difference in the energy around her. Paul began to visit more frequently. He came 2 or 3 times a week, always bringing something: flowers for the garden, old books he found in second-hand shops, sometimes just his presence and his gentle smile. Mrs. Antonia always reacted well to him, even on days when she didn't recognize him. There was a connection between them that transcended memory. It was during one of these visits, while the 2 brothers were having coffee in the garden, that Richard brought up the proposal again. "Paul, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. About you moving in here." Paul took a sip of coffee before answering. "I've been thinking too. It's tempting, you know, to have a real family, a home, but at the same time I'm scared. Scared of what? Of not fitting in. That the differences in our lives are too great. You're a successful businessman. You live in a mansion in Hampstead. I'm a state school caretaker. I live in Stratford. They're different worlds." Richard put his cup down and leaned forward. "Paul, I don't want you to move in here to become someone else. I want you here exactly as you are. In fact, I have a bigger proposal to make." "What kind of proposal?" Richard took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can honor Helen's memory, how I can do something meaningful that helps people like our mother. And I had an idea. I want to create a specialized center for the care of the elderly with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia." Paul's eyes widened with interest. "A care center?" "Yes, but not a typical nursing home. A place focused on human connection, on affection, on respect. A place where families know their loved ones will be treated with dignity, where caregivers are trained not just technically but emotionally. And I wanted to do it with you." "With me? But I have no experience with that." "You have more experience than you think. You work with children who have difficulties, who need patience and understanding. You know what it's like to care for someone vulnerable with love. That's more important than any degree. Besides, you've lived the experience of being left behind, of being seen as a burden. You know exactly what not to do." Paul was silent, clearly thinking. Richard continued. "I would provide the financial resources, the infrastructure. You would provide the human vision, the sensitivity. We could create something truly special. And our mother could be the first resident if we want, or she could stay here at home with full access to the resources and team we'll assemble. It's a beautiful idea, Richard, but it's also very big. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. No one is ever completely ready, but we learn together. And Paul, honestly, I think you were born for this. I've seen how you are with our mother, with such patience, with such care. You can't teach that." Paul looked at the garden at the house, then back at Richard. "Let me think about it some more. But I have to admit the idea is exciting me. Take your time, there's no rush." But Richard knew he had planted a seed, and from Paul's expression, that seed was already beginning to sprout. A few days later, Paul called. "I want to accept both proposals. I'll move in and we'll create this center together." Richard felt immense joy. "Really? Are you sure?" "I am. I talked to some friends, asked for advice, and they all told me the same thing, that this is an opportunity not just to rebuild my life, but to help many other people in the process. How can I refuse that?" "You can't, because it's your destiny, Paul, I'm sure of it." And so, Paul began to prepare for the move. He gave his notice at the school, explaining to the students that he was starting a new project, but that he wouldn't forget them. He organized his few possessions, carefully packing the photos of the children. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The day Paul moved into the mansion was a celebration. Edna prepared a special lunch with all the foods she had discovered were his favorites. Richard prepared one of the guest rooms, spacious and with a view of the garden. Mrs. Antonia, in one of her more lucid moments, seemed to understand that something important was happening and smiled more than usual. That evening, the three of them sat on the veranda, Richard, Paul, and Edna, talking about the future. Richard brought out blueprints and maps he had started to develop. "I've found a perfect plot of land in Richmond, near the tube station. It's over 1/2 acre, with old trees, lots of greenery, perfect for a welcoming environment." Paul studied the maps carefully. "How many people do you imagine the center will serve?" "Initially about 20. I don't want something too big. I prefer quality over quantity. Each resident will have an individualized care plan, personalized activities, constant monitoring." "And the staff?" asked Edna. "We'll need nurses, occupational therapists, psychologists specializing in geriatrics, but also people with sensitivity, like you, Edna. In fact, I wanted to make you a formal offer. I'd like you to be our head of resident care." Edna was speechless. "Me, Mr. Richard? But I don't have the qualifications for that." "You have something better than qualifications. You have experience and heart, and I can assure you that's worth more." Edna's eyes filled with tears. "It would be an honor." Paul smiled. "We're building an unlikely family, aren't we?" "The best kind of family," Richard replied. "The one we choose based on mutual love and respect." In the following months, the project took shape. Richard dedicated himself intensely, dividing his time between the textile company and planning the center. Paul immersed himself in studies on Alzheimer's, dementia, and human-centered care methods. They visited other centers, talked with specialists, and listened to families' stories. With each discovery, each conversation, the vision of what they wanted to create became clearer. It wouldn't just be a place to care for the elderly. It would be a space of dignity, where each person would be seen as the individual they always were, not just as a patient. Where memories would be honored, where music, art, and affection would be the primary therapeutic tools. Mrs. Antonia continued her journey with the disease, having better and worse days. But now she was surrounded by constant love. Richard spent every morning with her. Paul developed special activities like listening to old music, looking through photo albums, and taking short walks in the garden. Edna took care of every detail, ensuring comfort and affection. There were magical moments. Like the afternoon Paul put on an old record of classic ballads, and Mrs. Antonia began to hum along, remembering every word. Or when Richard brought out photos of their father, and she spent long minutes stroking the image, murmuring words of love. Or when the three of them, mother and sons, sat together on the garden swing, simply existing in the same space, connected by invisible but unbreakable bonds. One day, during a visit to the plot, in Richmond where the center would be built, Paul had an idea. "Richard, what if we plant red flowers all around the center, as a symbol of new beginnings, of new life?" Red flowers. Why specifically those? Because red is the color of life, of passion, of love. And that's what we want to create here, a place full of life and love. Richard smiled. Helen loved red flowers. She had a garden full of them. Then it's perfect. It will be a tribute to her as well. And so it was decided. The architectural design was adjusted to Include abundant gardens with a focus on red flowers of various species, geraniums, roses, hibiscus, and anthuriums. Construction began in the spring. Richard and Paul visited the site regularly, monitoring every stage. Paul had constant ideas on how to make the space more welcoming. He suggested that each room have a small balcony, that there be a music room, that the walls be painted in soft, warm tones. Edna, who had formally accepted the position of head of resident care, began recruiting the team. She looked not only for technical competence but primarily for empathy and patience. She conducted long interviews where she told stories about Mrs. Antonia, observing how the candidates reacted. Meanwhile, Richard and Veronica's divorce was finalized. As expected, she fought for every penny, but Richard handled everything through his lawyers, keeping his distance. In the end, she got the flat in Canary Wharf, a car, and a significant sum of money. Richard didn't care. The money was irrelevant compared to the peace he gained with her departure. 6 months after construction began, the centre was ready. It was beautiful. White walls with light wood details, large windows allowing for abundant natural light, lush gardens, and yes, red flowers. Everywhere. There was a large room for group activities, a library, a music room equipped with simple instruments, and spacious, comfortable rooms, each with its own personality. Paul suggested that each room be decorated according to the life story of its future resident. If the person had been a teacher, they could have a small bookshelf. If they loved gardening, plants on the balcony. If they loved music, a digital piano or guitar. The idea was to create environments that resonated with who each person had been, helping to keep their identity alive, even when memory failed. Richard was moved by his brother's sensitivity. "You have a natural talent for this, Paul. Maybe it's because I know what it feels like when no one cares about who you are. I want every person here to feel the opposite, to feel that their story matters, that their life had meaning." The opening was scheduled for a Saturday in October, as spring was giving way to summer. They invited families, professionals in the field, and local authorities. But the most important moment would be the arrival of the first resident, Mrs. Antonia. On the morning of the opening, Richard and Paul helped their mother get ready. Edna chose a light blue dress, Mrs. Antonia's old favorite. They lovingly combed her white hair and applied a soft lipstick. When she was ready, she smiled at her reflection in one of those rare moments of awareness. "Do I look pretty?" "You look beautiful, Mum," Richard replied, kissing her cheek. "The most beautiful," Paul added. At the centre, everything was prepared. The red flowers shone under the sun, visitors circulated, admiring the facility, and the staff was in position, ready to welcome everyone. When Richard arrived with Mrs. Antonia, Paul, and Edna, there was a moment of respectful silence. Paul pushed Mrs. Antonia's wheelchair to the centre of the main garden, where they had planted a particularly beautiful rose bush with enormous, vibrant red roses. He knelt beside her. "Mum, this place was made with love. It was made with you in mind, with how you deserve to be cared for, and it's going to help many other people too." Mrs. Antonia looked around, her eyes shining. She gently touched one of the roses. "It's beautiful. So beautiful." Richard approached, holding her hand. "This is our new beginning, Mum. For our whole family." Edna also came closer, kneeling on the other side. "And I promise, Mrs. Antonia, that every person who passes through these doors will be treated just like you, with respect, with dignity, with love." Mrs. Antonia looked at the three of them, one by one. For a moment, she seemed to fully recognize each of them, to understand exactly where she was and what it all meant. A tear ran down her cheek, and she smiled, the most genuine smile they had seen in a long time. "My sons, my family." It was then that Richard knew with absolute certainty that they were on the right path, that every pain, every discovery, every difficult decision had been worth it. Because there, in that garden full of red flowers, under the warm London sun, he had finally found what he was looking for, a true purpose, a real family, built not on lies and appearances, but on love and truth. And that was just the beginning. The first few months of the Anderson Care Center's operation were intense and challenging. Richard had imagined the transition would be smooth, but reality proved to be far more complex. Each new resident brought not only a medical condition but an entire life story, a family with its own pains and hopes and absolutely unique needs. The first family to seek out the center was the Silvers. Mr. Joseph was 79 and had moderate-stage Alzheimer's. His daughter, Marcia, arrived at the center visibly exhausted, carrying the weight of years of caring for her father alone, while working and raising 2 teenage children. When Paul welcomed her into his office and began to listen to her story, Marcia broke down in tears. "I can't do it anymore," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "I love my dad, more than anything, but I'm at my limit. I haven't slept properly in months, my marriage is hanging by a thread, my children complain that I have no time for them, and I feel terribly guilty for being here, considering putting him in a place like this." Paul gently held her hand. "Marcia, caring for someone with dementia is one of the hardest jobs there is. You're not failing by needing help. You're being brave by recognizing your limits. But he's my father. I should be able to take care of him. And you are. You're looking for the best place for him, where he'll have professional attention, suitable activities, an entire team dedicated to his well-being. That is love, Marcia. True love." Richard watched the scene from a distance, impressed by the natural ease with which Paul handled the delicate situation. His brother had a genuine gift for understanding people, for making them feel seen and welcomed. Mr. Joseph eventually became the center's second resident after Mrs. Antonia. At first he was confused and resistant, but he gradually adapted. Paul created a special routine for him, which included morning walks in the garden, having discovered that Mr. Joseph had been a postman for 40 years and loved to walk. He also organized sessions where Mr. Joseph could talk about his work memories, even if they were fragmented. The staff listened with genuine attention, validating every story, every memory. Soon, other residents arrived. Mrs. Mercedes, a former literature teacher who would quote lines of poetry even without remembering where she'd learned them. Mr. Oswald, who had been a carpenter and still had moments where his hands searched for imaginary tools. Mrs. Francesca, a retired pianist whose fingers still moved as if playing invisible keys. Each person brought their own light to the center, and Paul ensured that every story was honored. He set up a small adapted workshop where Mr. Oswald could sand soft pieces of wood under supervision. He placed a piano in the music room, especially for Mrs. Francesca, who could still play a few simple melodies. He created a library with Mrs. Mercedes's favorite books, where she would spend entire afternoons leafing through pages. Edna coordinated everything masterfully. She trained the staff not only in technical procedures, but more importantly in empathy. She would always repeat, "They are not just patients. They are people with rich lives, important stories. Our job is to honor who they were and who they still are." Richard divided his time between the textile company and the center. He discovered he could delegate more at the company than he had imagined, which gave him the freedom to be actively involved in the project he now considered his true calling. He handled the administrative and financial side, but he also made a point of getting to know every resident and every family. Mrs. Antonia had her good days and bad days. On good days, she would recognize her sons, smile at the other residents, and participate in activities. On bad days, she was lost in her own world, sometimes agitated, sometimes just silent. But she was always surrounded by care and affection. One day, about 3 months after the opening, something happened that deeply marked everyone at the center. It was a November afternoon, with that heavy warmth typical of the season's end. Mrs. Francesca was at the piano, trying to remember a melody. Her fingers hesitated over the keys, frustrated at not being able to access the muscle memory that had once been so natural. Paul was nearby, helping Mr. Oswald with a piece of wood, when he heard Mrs. Antonia start to hum. It was quiet at first, but then it grew louder. And then, miraculously, Mrs. Francesca began to play the melody Mrs. Antonia was humming. It was a classic love song. Other residents began to gather, drawn by the music. Mr. Joseph started clapping in rhythm. Mrs. Mercedes closed her eyes. swaying gently, and Mrs. Antonia, with her eyes closed, continued to sing, remembering every word. Richard came running from the administrative area, alerted by one of the carers. He stood frozen at the door, witnessing the magical moment. He saw his mother completely present, connected to the music, to the people around her, to life. He saw the other residents responding too, each in their own way, but all together in that shared instant of beauty. When the music ended, there was a reverent silence. Then everyone began to applaud, including the staff who had stopped to watch. Mrs. Antonia opened her eyes, a little confused by the attention, but smiling. Paul approached and kissed her forehead. "That was beautiful, Mum. You were beautiful." That night, during dinner at home, just the three of them, Richard, Paul, and Edna, they talked about what had happened. "It was a gift," said Edna, her eyes welling up, "to see Mrs. Antonia so present, so herself, even if just for a few minutes." "Music has that power," Paul reflected. "It accesses parts of the brain the disease hasn't reached yet. That's why we should use it more." Richard agreed. "We can create regular music therapy sessions, hire a specialized professional." And so they did. They hired Clara, a young music therapist, passionate about her work. She brought simple instruments, shakers, drums, triangles, and organized sessions twice a week where residents could actively participate, not just listening but creating music together. The results were astonishing. Residents who barely spoke began to hum. Those who were always agitated calmed down during the music. Visiting families were moved to see their loved ones responding in ways they hadn't seen in a long time. The center began to gain recognition. Reports in local newspapers highlighted its unique approach. Professionals in the field asked to visit, wanting to learn from the methods applied there. Families from other neighborhoods, even other cities, started inquiring about places. But Richard and Paul were firm about not expanding too quickly. They preferred to keep the number of residents manageable, ensuring each one received individualized attention. "Quality over quantity," Richard would always repeat. It was around this time that Richard received an unexpected phone call. It was Veronica. He hesitated before answering, but finally did. "What do you want, Veronica?" Her voice sounded different, less arrogant than he remembered. I saw the report about the center in the newspaper." "And?" There was a pause. "It looks beautiful. What you're doing." "It is. It's very rewarding. Richard, I wanted to apologize." He was surprised. "Apologize? For what exactly?" "For everything. For how I treated your mother. For not being the person you needed me to be. I saw the photos, I saw your mother smiling, and I realized how much cruelty was in me." Richard didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected this. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Veronica continued. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I recognize my mistakes, and that in some twisted way I regret them. I appreciate the call, and your honesty. But you're right. Some things can't be undone. I know, take good care of Mrs. Antonia, she deserves it." And the call ended. Richard stared at the phone for a few minutes, processing. There was no bitterness in his heart, just a quiet acceptance that that chapter was definitively closed. The months passed, and the center became a benchmark. Edna developed a training program for caregivers, passing on her years of experience and wisdom. Paul wrote a manual on human-centered dementia care, which began to be used by other centers. Richard established partnerships with universities, allowing nursing and gerontology students to do internships there. Mrs. Antonia continued her journey. The disease progressed slowly, but she was comfortable, surrounded by love. There were days she didn't recognize anyone, but even on those days when Paul or Richard held her hand, she would calm down, as if on some deep level she knew she was safe. A year after the opening, they decided to have a celebration. They invited all the families, the entire staff, professionals who had supported the project, and local authorities. It was a beautiful party, with live music, plenty of food, and much joy. During the celebration, Richard asked to speak. He stepped onto a small improvised stage in the garden, surrounded by the red flowers that had grown lush and vibrant. "I'd like to thank everyone who is here today. This center was born from pain, from the discovery of difficult truths about my family. But it has transformed into something much greater. It has transformed into hope, into love, into purpose." He looked at Paul, who was standing next to Mrs. Antonia. "And none of this would be possible without my brother Paul, a man who, despite being deprived of a family for most of his life, has a greater capacity for love and care than anyone I know." Paul smiled, his eyes shining. Richard continued, "I also want to thank Edna, who for decades cared for my mother with a dedication that goes far beyond professional duty. Edna, you are part of this family and always will be." The audience applauded. Edna discreetly wiped away her tears. "And finally, I want to talk about love. True love is not what expects perfection. It's not what endures only when everything is easy. True love is what remains through difficulties, what flourishes even in imperfection. It is the love we choose to give every day, even when it's hard." He looked at his mother, who was watching, the flowers with a distant smile. "My mother doesn't remember my name most days. She doesn't always recognize my face. But I love her. And that love doesn't depend on conscious reciprocation. It depends on choice, on commitment, on humanity." The audience was silent, many with tears in their eyes. Every person here, every resident of this center, has a story. They were someone important. They did incredible things. They loved and were loved. And even if memory fails, even if the mind gets lost, the essence remains. Our job here is to honor that essence, to ensure dignity, to provide moments of joy and connection. Richard paused, emotional. "And so, with every red flower planted in this garden, we reaffirm our commitment, the commitment that every human being deserves to be treated with respect and love, especially in the most vulnerable moments of life." The applause was warm and prolonged. People stood up, many crying openly. It was a moment of collective recognition of the importance of their work. After the speech, an elderly woman approached Richard. It was Marcia, the daughter of Mr. Joseph, the center's second resident. "Mr. Richard, I don't know how to thank you. My father is so well here. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm failing him. I know he's in good hands. Your gratitude is all the thanks we need, Marcia." She hugged Richard, then Paul, then Edna. "You're making a difference in the lives of so many families. Never forget that." The party continued until nightfall. When everyone had left, and only the staff was tidying up, Richard, Paul, and Edna sat together on a garden bench. "Tired?" asked Paul. "Exhausted," Richard admitted, "but happy. Very happy." "Mrs. Helen would be proud," Edna said softly. "So proud of you both." "I think about her every day," Richard confessed, "about how she had the wisdom to keep that letter, to trust that I would find it at the right time. If it weren't for her, none of this would exist. I'd still be living a lie, far from my brother, ignoring my mother's suffering." "She knew you well," said Paul. "She knew that when you were ready, you would do the right thing." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the stars begin to appear in the London sky. "You know," Paul said finally, "I spent my whole life feeling incomplete, like something essential was missing. Now I know what it was. It was family, it was belonging, it was having a purpose greater than myself." Richard put his hand on his brother's shoulder. "And now you have all of that." "I do, and it's more than I could have ever dreamed of." In the months that followed, the center continued to grow in reputation and impact. But beyond the external successes, there were the small, daily miracles. Like when Mr. Oswald finished a small wooden box and gifted it to his granddaughter, who cried with emotion. Or when Mrs. Mercedes recited an entire poem by Christina Rossetti during a reading session, surprising everyone. Or when Mrs. Francesca played a Chopin sonata, her hands moving with a grace that seemed impossible. Mrs. Antonia had her moments too. One day, during a visit to the garden, she looked at the red flowers and murmured something about Helen. Richard quickly approached. "What did you say, Mum?" "Helen. She liked red flowers." Richard felt his heart ache. "Yes, Mum, she loved red flowers." And these flowers are in honor of her." Mrs. Antonia smiled. "She was good, very good. She was, Mum, the best." It was on an April afternoon, almost 2 years after the centre's opening, that something happened that Richard would never forget. Mrs. Antonia was having a particularly lucid day. She had recognized both her sons in the morning, chatted over breakfast, and even made a few jokes, something that hadn't happened in months. Paul suggested a walk in the garden, and the three went together. They walked slowly, Mrs. Antonia between her 2 sons, each holding one of her arms. The sun was warm. A gentle breeze made the flowers sway. They stopped by the main rosebush, the one they had planted on opening day. It was beautiful, full of huge red roses. Mrs. Antonia touched one of the roses carefully. "You've made something beautiful here." "We did it for you, Mum," said Richard. "For all the people who need care," Paul added. She looked at both of them, and in that moment, her eyes were completely clear, completely present. "I've done many wrong things in my life. Your father too. Things I can't fix anymore." Paul squeezed her hand. "The past doesn't matter anymore, Mum." "Yes, it does. I abandoned you. I let them take you away. I'm guilty of that." Tears streamed down her face. Paul was crying too. "But I forgive you," he said. "I forgave you a long time ago, and now we're together. That's what matters." Mrs. Antonia hugged Paul, holding him with surprising strength. "I'm sorry, my son, so sorry." "It's okay, I'm here, we're all here." Richard embraced them both, and they stood like that for long minutes, a family hug of healing and forgiveness. When they let go, Mrs. Antonia smiled through her tears. "I'm happy. Despite everything, I'm happy." And those were the last completely lucid words Mrs. Antonia would ever speak. In the following days and months, she sank deeper into the disease. But Richard and Paul knew she had given them the greatest possible gift in that moment of lucidity, the peace of knowing that in the end, there was love and forgiveness. The centre continued its work, touching lives, bringing comfort to families, and providing dignity to dozens of seniors. Richard further reduced his hours at the textile company, finally appointing a CEO to handle daily operations. His real work was now here at the centre, alongside his brother. Paul became a well-known figure in the geriatric care community, speaking at conferences, writing articles, always emphasizing the importance of human-centered care. But his favorite place was still on the floor of the centre, interacting directly with the residents. Edna trained a new generation of caregivers, passing on not just techniques, but an entire philosophy of care based on empathy and respect. She finally accepted the gift Richard had insisted on giving her, a small cottage on the mansion's grounds, where she could live with total independence but still be close to the family she loved. And so, from a painful discovery, from truths buried for decades, from the mistakes of the past, something beautiful was born. A family rebuilt not by blood alone, but by choice. A purpose found not in wealth or status, but in service and love. A life that honored both the dead and the living. Richard often thought of Helen's letter, of the words she had left. She had trusted that he, when ready, would make the right choice. And he had. It hadn't been easy. It had required courage to face uncomfortable truths, to let go of toxic relationships, to embrace responsibilities he had neglected. But looking around, seeing Paul laughing with the residents, seeing Edna patiently guiding a new caregiver, seeing his mother sleeping peacefully in her comfortable room, he knew that every choice, every step had been worth it. True love, he had learned, was not what expects perfection. It was what flourishes even in imperfection. It was what chooses to stay, chooses to care, chooses to honor. It was what transforms pain into purpose, mistakes into learning, and endings into new beginnings. And there, in that garden full of red flowers under the London sky, the Anderson family had finally found its true form. Not the perfect image they had tried to project for generations, but the imperfect and beautiful reality of people choosing to love one another every day in the best way they could. And that, they discovered, was more than enough. It was everything. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Richard, Paul, and Mrs. Antonia has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of family reunion, forgiveness and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. Was it the brothers' reunion? Richard's transformation? Edna's dedicated love? Share with us. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the most human and true side of each of us. Stories about family, resilience, and the transformative power of love. Don't miss the next episode. Until next time, and may the Anderson story inspire you to cherish who truly matters in your life.